Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we continue our preparations for the State of the World Forum, which will be an online interactive broadcast between the 14th and the 17th of December, coming up at the end of this year. Today, I want to focus on the current state of our world as it relates to this larger issue that the State of the World Forum is seeking to convene a global conversation around. And that is that we're having four intelligences with us, and yet there's only one future. And the human condition in which we find ourselves, the human intelligence, that's us, is in very, very precarious conditions. And I want to dwell on the fragility of human affairs at the present moment by covering three aspects of major concern. First, the announcement on Truth Social a few days ago by President Trump that he is ordering the military to begin nuclear testing. Secondly, I want to talk about what is now beginning to take place in Gaza. And thirdly, I want to circle back to the United States for an update on the rising authoritarianism that is gripping the political establishment in the United States of America. We're in a very dangerous moment. When President Trump, without any consultation with Congress, with any of the specialists, at least that has been reported in the news, just announced casually on Truth Social that he was ordering the re-engagement of the United States in nuclear weapons testing. He escalated the dangers of nuclear exchange and the proximity of a potential third world war to even more dangerous levels than it already is. And I think it's important for us all to just sort of take a moment to understand the gravity of what's taking place. Let's start at the beginning. It was in 1963 when President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It was the first treaty that was ever negotiated to begin the process of eliminating nuclear weapons. It was very limited to above ground nuclear testing, but over the decades, it was signed by 187 nations around the world. The agreements were extended to include, by 1990s, a prohibition on even underground nuclear testing. So since 1992, with the exception of North Korea, there's been no nuclear testing by the United States, by Russia, by China, by Britain, by France since the 90s. President Trump's announcement upends that in a very dramatic way. It was in 1972 that President Nixon and Premier Leonid Brezhnev negotiated the anti-ballistic missile treaty that forbade either country from trying to build a missile defense system because correctly, both sides understood that that would just reignite an arms race by different means. more defense, more offense to get through the defense. So it was agreed that in that the countries involved in the nuclear weapons procurement would not build defense mechanisms. That treaty also was abrogated by an American president, President Bush Jr., in 2002. In 1987, there was yet another treaty negotiated, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, by President Bush Sr. and Mikhail Gorbachev. And that forbade either country from deploying short-range nuclear weapons in Europe because the time it takes for a nuclear weapon to get from Germany to Russia is literally within seconds. So it was correctly understood after massive protests throughout Europe against the cruise and Pershing II missiles that both sides would not engage in the deployment of intermediate nuclear forces in Europe. And again, it was an American president, President Trump, in 2019, that abrogated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement and began to deploy nuclear weapons in Europe. Germany, Romania, and elsewhere. The Russians have been calling to every US president not to dismantle the Nuclear Forces Agreement, but to strengthen the nuclear reduction treaties. There's not a single instance where the Russians have engaged in an abrogation of a nuclear treaty or an escalation in the arms race. What's happened over the last several weeks is important for us to understand in light of this. There's increasing pressure on the Trump administration by the neocons, both in Europe and in the United States, to compensate for the fact that Ukraine is losing the war dramatically, with thousands of Ukrainians being killed every day, by escalating the nuclear tension. So rather than doing the obvious, recognizing that the war should be over and negotiating a peace agreement, the Europeans and the neocons in the United States, now led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and various other people in the administration, have been pressuring to escalate toward the nuclear option. This is what the Tomahawk missiles have been all about. And before that, the ATACMS and the Shadowhawks and the other nuclear missiles were all provocations by NATO and the United States against the Russians. Why? Because these missiles are not capable of being operated by the Ukrainians. So what was developing was that Western European and American personnel were targeting, launching, and guiding conventional missiles without nuclear warheads deep inside Russia. And the Russians said, our war is with Ukraine, And if the United States and Europe start to enter in and actually deploy weapon systems attacking deep into Russia, that's a red line. And we'll consider that an act of war by the Europeans and by the Americans. And we may be forced to strike back, not against Ukraine, but against Britain or France or the United States that's launching weapons into our airspace and destroying our cities. It's worth remembering that at no point during the Cold War, not once, did the United States or the Soviet Union deploy forces or even give weapons to proxy states like North Vietnam or South Vietnam or the various other places around the world where the superpowers were contesting influence and control. By agreement, they never gave their proxies weapons that could attack the other superpower, much less go in to the proxy state with US or European NATO personnel and fire the weapons going into the other superpower. That's been happening for several years now in Ukraine. And finally, last week, Putin gave several speeches, which he said, this is crazy. The Americans need to know that we are fully capable of protecting ourselves. And in fact, we have weapons now that can take the entire nuclear situation to the next level. And he talked about weapons that can create depth charges in the ocean and create tsunamis that go and wipe out the coast of the United States or Europe or anywhere. They have cruise missiles, which they've developed, that don't just go across from Siberia to Chicago in a straight line. They can be launched in Russia. They can fly without limit anywhere in the world and attack the United States from any vantage point. Think about that. They have the Oreshnik missile, which they demonstrated about a year and a half ago in Ukraine after the last U.S. provocation of U.S. personnel targeting, pushing the button, and guiding missiles deep into Russia. They sent an Oreshnik traveling, I think it was, if my memory serves me correctly, 10 times the speed of sound, moving so fast that its impact is the magnitude of a nuclear weapon, but without any nuclear weapon. So what Putin was saying to the Americans and to the world, stop it. You don't want to go here. You do not want to do this. But the neocons can't stop. They believe in perpetual war. What they want in Ukraine, just so everybody's clear, they want a ceasefire. Why do they want a ceasefire? Because they want a frozen conflict, just like they have in North and South Korea. For 50, 60, 70 years later, there's still conflict. There's still massive militaries. There's the DMZ, which supports the military-industrial complex. That's what they want in Ukraine. And what are the Russians saying? They're saying the same thing since Gorbachev. We want peace. We want an overarching security agreement between Europe and Russia so that we can have peace. We don't want a frozen conflict for the next 50 years. And what do the Americans do after Putin's speeches? Instead of understanding what he's saying, all you hear in the American press is that Putin is escalating. And then Trump says, okay, we're going to start testing our nuclear weapons, which has nothing to do with anything, because by the time you test, it's going to be 3 or 4 or 5 years, but it escalates the tension and makes it virtually impossible for any serious discussion about how one really ends this conflict when there's no willingness on the part of the Western Europeans or the Americans to actually reach a solution that creates the conditions for peace. It's a total tragedy. It's a total unmitigated tragedy for the Ukrainians who are dying every day by the thousands as the Russians just keep pushing east. And the Russians have been making it clear they're happy to stop at any point for a real peace agreement. But that is falling on deaf ears. And the nuclear threat continues to escalate. We're now at 89 seconds to midnight, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they move it even closer. World War III could come out of the refusal of NATO and the United States to in any way lessen that conflict. It's the same mentality that is taking place in Gaza. You remember several weeks ago when there was this much heralded ceasefire. Trump went to the Knesset in Jerusalem and then went to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and everybody thought, oh, it's over. And I said then what I said now. This was just a publicity stunt. It had no bearing in reality. And a number of you wrote emails and had comments that why was I such a pessimist? Well, I'll tell you, several weeks later, what I predicted is taking place. Just yesterday, the Israelis killed another 100 Palestinians, with more being killed today. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were on 60 Minutes on CBS the other day, and they were talking about the master plan for Gaza. And the master plan calls for all the Palestinians to be put in concentration camps, biometric concentration camps in the South. And then they're going to completely rebuild Gaza to a Trump Riviera, Israeli resort, and wait until they can force the Egyptians to accept all the Palestinians, which so far the Egyptians have refused. But with enough bribe money and with enough pressure, the Israelis and the Americans are sure that in the end, they can complete the final solution of the Palestinians and build Club Med. Extraordinary to watch this unfold right before our eyes. And that leads to what's going on here in the United States. As we see more and more indications of the authoritarian takeover that all of us know is happening. But because it's in slow motion, it's hard to detect the escalations. The government shut down about 3 weeks ago, as we all know, and tomorrow the welfare food stamps basically to 48 million Americans, 16 million of whom are children, uh, ceases unless mandated to the contrary by court order. The Trump administration is saying that it doesn't want to feed the children because it wants to keep the money for an emergency. What on earth constitutes an emergency when 16 million children and many of their parents don't have enough money to put food on the table without support? It's extraordinary. I've made the point many times before that it's the same consciousness in Ukraine with the nuclear weapons escalations, with full participation in the genocide in Gaza, that is transacting the authoritarian escalations inside the United States. It's the same mentality. We often think that some politicians do some things, good things, and some bad things, as if they're schizophrenic. Most of them are not. They have a single worldview, which they apply across the board. And that's what we're seeing now out of the Trump White House, is this malignancy of darkness at every level of contact with reality. Just this past week, the ICE agents were told, the officers, that they were going to be replaced, many of them, by the Customs and Border Patrol. Steve Miller has mandated that the current rate of picking up 900 people of color to check to see whether they are documented or undocumented aliens is going to be increased to 3,000 a day. They know that this is going to cause massive domestic unrest, as we've seen in LA and in Chicago and in every other city that's had the military forces of the United States, the National Guard, deployed. So what are they doing? They're ordering that the National Guard, every single National Guard unit in the country, all 50 states, have to start training for crowd control, riot control, rapid strike responses. So this is important for all Americans and people around the world to understand that what's now going to start to happen in the United States over the balance of this year and going into next year is 3,000 deportations a day, 3,000 arrests a day across the United States of America, dealing with the inevitable social turbulence with the application of military force on American cities. It's an extraordinary thing. And that leads us to the 2026 elections and the 2028 elections. As you know from the news, the Trump administration is seeking in every conceivable way to limit the vote, outlawing mail-in ballots, deploying restrictive measures particularly in states and cities, jurisdictions that have a majority of Democrats as opposed to Republicans, gerrymandering one state after another to increase the number of safe districts for Republicans, so that even though they lose the majority vote, as they almost certainly will in 2026, if there's any kind of fair election at all, they can still maintain control of the Senate and the House because they've gerrymandered the districts to compensate for the number of districts they would lose if the vote was fair. There's more and more discussion by Donald Trump himself, Steve Bannon, master strategist for the Republicans, about the fact that Donald Trump is going to win the presidency again in 2028, even though it's a violation of the Constitution and the 28th Amendment, which says very explicitly that you can't run for the presidency more than 2 times. And Steve Bannon is saying, don't worry about it. We've got people working the problem. At the same time that that's happening, Russell Vought, who's the head of the Office of Management and Budget, one of the architects from the Heritage Foundation that wrote and designed the Project 2025, is eviscerating one government agency after another, so that the federal government as an institution is eviscerated. This leads me to an analysis that I would like to put forward that I think is really important for us to bear in mind. It's clear to many observers that Trump is slipping into dementia of one kind or another, just like Joe Biden. The cognitive incapacities of Joe Biden were very apparent publicly as well as privately for several years. That is now happening at an accelerated level with Donald Trump. That's dangerous enough as it is, when the president, with his finger the closest to the nuclear button, is wandering around, as he was seen in Japan, not quite sure where he was anymore. Remember all those scenes with Joe Biden where he lost track of which side of the stage he should exit and would kind of walk around with a blank stare on his face? That's happening to Trump. So the courtiers, as happens in every monarchy, begin to seize control and use the vacant throne for their own purposes. And what's happening now in the United States, I would say, if there's 2 people in the Trump administration that control the domestic agenda, it's Steve Miller, the deputy chief of staff, and Russell Vought, the head of the Office of Management and Budget. They're implementing Plan 2025 through the OMB, and they're implementing the dragnet against people of color through Steve Bannon and ICE and the Border and Custom Patrols. Russell Vought is a Christian white supremacist, Christian nationalist, and Steve Miller is a Zionist, Jewish supremacist, nationalist. And that mentality is gripping the White House as the courtiers, people in the cabinet, seize control, as Donald Trump does whatever Donald Trump does. In international affairs, it's increasingly Marco Rubio, an arch neocon, an arch Zionist, an arch conservative. It's Marco Rubio that's behind the increasing conflict and escalations against Colombia and Venezuela and Cuba. He hates the current regime in Cuba. He's been wanting to overthrow the government in Venezuela for some time. And this is what we see. They're blowing ships out of the water without any due process. Little tiny little boats that they say are carrying drugs, but they're not big enough to make it from Colombia or Venezuela to Miami, but they're just blowing them out of the water in what is clearly extrajudicial killings. And now also in the Pacific, that's all Marco Rubio. That's the neocons. It's an extraordinary thing. And now we're going to probably witness over the next couple weeks or the next month an attempted regime change in Venezuela, maybe in Colombia, as the United States continues its aggressive escalatory postures in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and now Latin America. It's worth remembering the Monroe Doctrine for a moment, just to get a measure of how out of control this country actually is. You know, the Monroe Doctrine, articulated by President Monroe in 1823, basically said, European countries, the imperial powers, stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and we'll stay out of Europe. Fine. Then beginning in the 20th century, when it was clear that no other power was going to try anything until Russia tried it in Cuba in the 1961-62 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Americans expanded the Monroe Doctrine to include any liberal, any leftist government, any socialist government, and overthrew one regime after another just because they didn't like the politics of whoever happened to be elected democratically. In Chile, for example, in 1970, 71, if my memory serves me correctly, with the election of Allende. Nixon administration, Henry Kissinger came in and murdered him and overthrew the government and instilled the military junta of Pinochet. That's happened dozens of times. And there's no particular reason other than the United States just doesn't like them. So this is way beyond the Monroe Doctrine. The president of Colombia at the moment is a young man who used to be a student activist. He rose into the ranks and became democratically elected, and he's trying to help the people of Colombia. He has liberal points of view, like, say, Mamdani in New York. And the United States wants to overthrow him and engage in regime change because they don't want the Colombians to experience what, God forbid, Zoran Mamdani might do in New York by offering free public transportation or rent control. That's considered communist and to be eliminated. That's why there's every effort in this country to make sure that Mamdani doesn't win. And it's one of these flukes in history that the more they try to oust him, the more popular he becomes. It's really amazing how history can be inverted like that as a great power seeks to suppress that which is true. And then the more popular support that person obtains. Let us hope and pray that that takes place in New York City. What a great day that would be when a man with the politics that they're seeking to overthrow in Colombia is democratically elected in New York. Just think that thought for a fun thing to think about on Halloween. This leads me to the final point that I want to make, everyone, about the current state of the world in this moment. And that is that this is all predictable. This is what great powers do. At the last stage of collapse, after engaging in senseless, expensive wars like trillions of dollars in Afghanistan, more trillions in Iraq, overthrowing governments all over the world, upwards of 100 governments have been overthrown by the United States since the end of the Second World War. Take that in. 100 governments. There was nearly 70 covert overthrows between 1945 and 1989, and another 30 or 40 since then. Many don't even make the news. But as the imperium collapses, it becomes more vicious because it's collapsing. And it doesn't know how to right itself. So it seeks more desperately to escalate tensions everywhere that it can. So you see that that's happening in the United States right now. We've lost the war in Ukraine. China and Russia have bonded together in a grand alliance with dozens and dozens of countries around the world, 100 countries trying now to join the BRICS as the rising Asia, the global majority, begins to take shape. Israel is a pariah in the Middle East and is doing the same thing that the United States is doing. The more isolated it becomes, the more vicious it becomes. It's at war with 7 other countries in the Middle East right now. And it's plotting its next attack on Iran, hopefully with US support. It's come into the United States and is viciously suppressing any dissent, any of the Palestinian voices. That's a symptom of desperation. It's a symptom of an imperium very close to collapse. And that leads me to the State of the World Forum and what we're trying to do in December and between now and 2030. In our view, we are so far off center, as I've just described, that we are way past any particular solutions because the solutions have been here for many, many decades and many, many years, and they're just simply not being implemented. So we're juxtaposing, this is important, we're juxtaposing the first 2 of the most consequential truths of our time, that we're facing ecological collapse, and as I've just described, we're facing instability at every level of human affairs. That's true. We're juxtaposing those truths with 2 other truths. we've unleashed AI to make our situation even more complicated. And the US government is telling us that the ETs are here, non-human intelligences are here, cosmic intelligences are here. So if you look into the depths of our crisis, what emerges is these four intelligences that we keep talking about. Human intelligence, which is really out of control. Nature intelligence, and we are out of control with each other along the lines I just described, most fundamentally because we're out of alignment with nature. That was the great insight of Carl Jung about the rise of the Nazis. He said, at its root, this kind of violence only emerges when people get disconnected from nature. So this interactive activity between human intelligence and nature intelligence, I believe, is primary. We have cosmic intelligence. We have AI intelligence. But if you had to source the origin of the human predicament, it's we've lost our alignment with nature herself. So what the State of the World Forum is seeking to do is bring these intelligences together. Because if human intelligence could start to engage in intelligible communication with nature intelligence, as we'll be demonstrating in the forum with Veda Austin on water and Gary Shapiro with the orangutans and various other people, Bertie Jaworski, Chris Bledsoe with the ETs, et cetera, et cetera. If we can start engaging in intelligible communication, we'll elevate our consciousness to be able to solve the problems for the first time. So the State of the World Forum, in my view, and I think Tom Eddington, in my view, is a great antidote to the crises of our time, not by trying to solve the specific crises, but by elevating consciousness, by learning the language of consciousness. Thereby enabling us to tame AI. I don't believe AI will be regulated. I think it'll only be tamed through an integration with nature intelligence and cosmic intelligence. And I want to finally close with this one singular point. I want to address cosmic intelligence. We're going to have an astronomer on Humanity Rising next Friday, Beatrice Villarreal, whose breakthrough study just released is creating a consternation and a great debate. She's taken photographs of the sky between 1945 and I believe it's the late 1960s, early 60s, where there was no human object in space. The first human object didn't go up till 1958 with Sputnik. And the first American one, not till 1961. So there were a long time where there was no satellites in space that could complicate things, but there was lots of nuclear testing, above ground nuclear testing till the 60s. And what she's discovered is that UFOs can be spotted not on Earth, but in the atmosphere, monitoring our nuclear tests. And as the nuclear tests would take place, the number of UFOs would increase. When there wasn't any testing, the UFOs would decrease. And she tracks this over years. As we contemplate our predicament, What is emerging is that our predicament is actually being held by higher intelligences that are doing everything they can through the presencing of the orbs all over Europe, in New Jersey, at times of acute nuclear activity, escalations in the nuclear threat. That's also happening. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why we need to become conversant in the language of consciousness, mental telepathy, all kinds of remote viewing and clairvoyance. Because the quicker we can be able to engage in intelligible communication with the ETs and why they're here, which is to warn us about the nuclear weapons and our ecological destruction, the quicker we're going to be fortified to align ourselves once again with Mother Nature, with the Mother. So what the State of the World Forum is seeking to do at this moment of incredible duress, when many people can't even bear to watch the news anymore, is to create a vision of hope and possibility and unlimited abundance if we would just simply commune with these other intelligences that are manifesting themselves all around us. That's why I urge all of you to sign up for the State of the World Forum. It only costs $2.95, but if you aren't able to pay that, we have scholarships, including full scholarships. We want people to attend. We want people to participate. We want people to engage in the opportunities inherent in our crises in as abundant a way as we possibly can. And next week, we'll have Beatrice Valario, and each week up until the forum, we'll be bringing you other speakers that are just delightfully engaged in the creation of the new paradigm necessary to ensure human survival and a co-creative act between humanity, nature, AI, and the cosmos for what this beautiful planet of ours could potentially be. That's why it's an exciting moment to be alive. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time today as we ponder these great issues impinging upon us. It's such an extraordinary moment. It's just an extraordinary moment. I'll join the after chat for a little bit, and you'll see the link in your chat box, and you received it in your Zoom reminder for today. And then we'll be back next week with this astronomer, with this incredible breakthrough in how attentive the cosmos is to what we little humans are doing on this beautiful, precious planet. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.